Welcome back to the Big Jake podcast. It's April 2nd, 2022. Going to go through some recent comedy news. So on Monday, I was at Planet of the Tapes here in Louisville doing their open mic. It's one of the better open mics in the city. Really enjoyed that. Did some new stuff. Didn't go great, didn't go awful. Learning experience. On Wednesday, went to the Caravan. The Caravan Wednesday open mic is usually really good, and it had a good crowd of people paying attention. But they didn't seem to like any of the comedians. It was an odd experience. I was sixth or so on the list, and I wanted to work on some new stuff, but I also thought if I did some really good old material, I could get the crowd all jazzed up and them having a good time. But that's not what an open mic is for. I needed to work on the old material, or the new material. On Thursday, went over to Fall City, and we were supposed to have a show there, but they didn't sell a lot of tickets, and we ended up just doing an open mic, which was pretty fun. I enjoyed that. I did a couple of new jokes, even different from the ones on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. But it worked out pretty well. Then on Friday, just a couple of days ago, I was at Laugh Louisville, which is the new club. It was the last day of what they're calling their soft opening. So Ryan Hamilton was there on April 1st, and he's there tonight as well. But on the 31st of March, they had a bunch of locals, and I was the host. So I got to introduce the other comedians. They were great. The crowd was a little on the small side. It's still a new club. It's a Friday night at 7. So some of those are just plain factors. But we had Keith McGill, Rich Reagans, Gwen Sunkel, Mandy McKelvey, Eric Kimbrough. So a lot of really good comedians. Afterwards, they had a green horse in the lobby, and they let the comedians sign the green horse. Well, I am going to sign this green horse, but I'm not going to sign it right on the side. I signed it on the back of one of the ears, so you really can't see it. I can see it, though. I know it's there. I'm excited. But the coolest thing that happened this week was last night. I was at Fort Wayne Comedy Club. I headlined 2 shows there. It was an absolute blast. Manuel T was the feature. Funny guy. Michael Moses was the host. He's also the owner of the club. Both of those guys did great. I really enjoyed it. For the first time at a show, I sold merchandise afterwards. I sold some t-shirts. Been working on the design for the last week. The design came out really well. I was excited about selling t-shirts. Sold 6, which is pretty good. So upcoming in the next week, Tonight I have a show at Louisville Comedy Club, which it's been a while since I've been there, so I'm excited to go back. I'm doing 15 minutes. It's a locals only showcase, so it's not gonna be sold out. It's not gonna be overrun. It'll be a good show. It's not gonna be a show to write home about, but it'll be a good show. On Wednesday of next week, I'm doing a online showcase. During the COVID lockdowns, pandemics, I did a ton of online shows. I did online open mics, online showcases, all sorts of stuff. It's a different beast. It's not as fun as in person, but it's not awful. It does make you write in kind of a different way. I feel like some of the bits that I'm more excited about, I wrote because I had to write something that would play just like this, just voice and a little bit of my face. So not a big physical joke or a I look like joke or whatever, but just go for it. Then this weekend, April 6th, 7th, and 8th, I am hosting at the Caravan here in Louisville. One of my favorite clubs, super fun. Probably would consider it my home club. I'm there a lot, and I'm hosting this weekend for Sean Smith, who's a local guy and is an absolute killer. He is so funny, and he's a good guy. He works in education. He's not a teacher, but he works in the public school system. So we've got education as something in common. He's very funny, and I'm looking forward to it. I didn't actually know it was for Sean Smith until just about 10 minutes ago, and I looked it up, and I was excited to see, wow, I would want to see that show. So I'm glad that I will be paid to be there. In other news, this Tuesday, so just a few days ago, or last Tuesday, however we're saying that, last Tuesday, I was at Headliners here in Louisville, which is a place that does music, and I participated in The Moth. So it was a storytelling event. Had no idea what it would look like going in. Just bought a ticket, showed up, and was surprised and also excited. The place was packed. There was a lot of people there. They were all very excited for the stories. Most of the stories were rather serious with a little touches of humor. I tried to do a story that was basically all humor. It got a lot of laughs. The thing I didn't understand, I didn't know about The Moth, is they grade or judge the stories right there in front of you. There's 3 different groups of judges. They will give you a number out of 10. And right then, you'll know how you stack up to the other stories. So I was the 7th story, and I noticed that a lot of the stories were being judged very favorably, but all kind of in the same general numbers. I did my story. I didn't end it very well, but got a lot of laughs. Really enjoyed it. Crowd was great. Got off stage, and they gave me my my scores. I knew I wasn't going to win, but I was the lowest scored storyteller, which is exactly what I wanted. I want to stretch. This is the idea, is I'm trying to do something that I'm not good at. So I'll give that a chance. I'm going to go next time they have it. They'll have one in April. They'll have one in May. I'm planning on going again and again and again, writing the stories, trying to get up, do it as often as I can, because that's the only way I'm going to get better. It was a little bit, I don't know, frustrating might be too strong of a word, but I was there and the crowd was great and they were hanging on every word. And I thought for a moment, if I just do my stand-up, this place will be rolling with laughter. But that's not the game. That's not what they're there for. It would have worked, but it's not what the spirit is. So I instead told a story. I told a story about when I climbed Pikes Peak. And I barely made it to the top of Pikes Peak before the closing. It was more dangerous than it really should have been. Because if you don't make it to the top, what are you going to do? Just live on Pikes Peak now? But I'm going to tell you this other story. This happened not too long ago. Probably in 2020. No, this definitely happened in 2020 because it's COVID related. Well, I got COVID, lost my taste and smell for a month, which was such a bummer. Then, when 2021 rolled around, I noticed that they were putting out advertisements for people that have recovered from COVID to give plasma. I used to give plasma a lot. When I was in seminary, I gave plasma 2 or 3 times a week. I have very distinctive memories of having this large gauge needle in one arm and Pilgrim's Progress in my other hand, reading Pilgrim's Progress while giving plasma. And they use this real large gauge needle where they pull out a bunch of blood, they spin it in a thing, and then they put a lot of the blood back as well as saline, which is real weird. It feels bizarre because the saline that they put in to replace the plasma is room temperature, but your body is not room temperature. So it feels very cold going into you, and you can feel it up in your veins and into your chest. It's an experience. But in 2021, I heard that they needed plasma from people who had gotten over COVID. I thought I'd give it a shot. So I went to one of the plasma centers. I was living in Aurora, Colorado at the time. Went to one of the plasma centers, and they did a couple of tests. They did some interviews. I was laying on a gurney or a stretcher deal for a little while. And then they weighed me. And the woman got real weird when she weighed me. She stopped talking and then went and got a supervisor. And the supervisor came and said, "I'm sorry, we can't take your plasma. Are you going to argue with me?" I said, "No, I'm not going to argue with you." And then I left. It was a weird experience. Like, she was expecting a fight, but okay, you don't want my plasma? I'm just trying to help. But I went to another place. Now, Before I did this, I looked up if there's a weight limit to plasma. Can you weigh too much for donating plasma? Nowhere on the website did it say anything about that. They talked about you can weigh too little. If you're very small, you're not supposed to give plasma, but you can't weigh too much. So I went to another plasma center. In Aurora, there was 2 within a mile of my house. Went to this other one. Did the whole training seminar where they would show you videos of what is plasma and how do they get it, all that stuff. And I knew, but they still went through all of that. And I, again, went through a little, not a physical, but questions, and they weighed me. I cheated the scale. At the time, I was well north of 500 pounds. But I figured 500 might be a limit. So when I stepped on the scale, I didn't fully step on the scale. However, it still came out to like 460, something like that. And I was like, that's pretty good. And then they made me wait in this little room. And I was waiting in this little room until a male nurse, I think he was a nurse, but a male guy in scrubs, and he was chubby, a chubby male nurse, comes up to me and says, yeah, you weigh too much. You are too heavy to give plasma. I didn't know that was a thing, but apparently it is. You cannot weigh over 400 pounds and give plasma, which was interesting because I also cheated the scale and still was too heavy. He said, if you want to lose weight and come back, then you can. Now, since then, I have lost a significant amount of weight. I'm under 400. I can go give plasma, but I haven't. I probably won't. It was an interesting thought. I'm here to try to help people. We don't want your fat guy plasma. So I'm going to talk about some books that I have been reading. One book that I finished yesterday. It was an audiobook and I finished it on the drive. Some people think that audiobooks don't count. Those people are wrong. Audiobooks 1,000% count. If you're paying attention, they count. Now, if you play the audiobook and then you fall asleep, no, it doesn't count. But I am paying very close attention to the audiobooks, so much so that I pause them frequently and take notes on what is being said. I quote unquote highlight the audiobook. So I'm paying attention. Plus, some audiobooks that I do are fiction. Do you really have to pay that close attention to fiction? You know, it's silly to make rules on this is reading and that's not reading. No, those are books. Anyway, I finished this book on my way to Fort Wayne. Yesterday, I finished the book called Embrace the Suck. It is by Brent Gleason. He's a Navy SEAL, and it's all about embracing challenges and making the challenges harder, being comfortable, being uncomfortable. He says stuff like that. It is a good time. It was a good book. I enjoyed it. It was pretty short and challenging. I took a lot of notes on it. He recommended some other books throughout the book, and I'll give those a shot. I do remember watching those old documentaries where people were trying to make the cut for the Navy SEALs or what Special Forces training is like, and man, it looks awful. Now, those guys are much smaller than me. Those guys are, none of them are even close to 6'8". There's not huge guys in special forces. Those guys are little and wiry and distance runners and things like that. Still, I would not want to do that at all. Sounds awful. And he describes it in detail, all of these things that they had to just suffer and suffer and suffer. While it does sound bad, I understand the need, maybe, for suffering. The way that suffering is part of life and how it accompanies things that are worth doing. If you didn't suffer to create something, then it's probably not as well made. It's probably not as creative. If you labored over a work of art, a comedy routine, a book, then when it's done, you take much more satisfaction than if you just said, Control all, here's all of my tweets, print, there it is. That's not as fun. If something's worth doing, it's worth suffering for, at least a little bit. One of the other books that I'm reading, I got this from the library, is Delete That by John Crist. He's a Christian comedian. He's pretty well known in some circles. In some other circles, he's not well known at all. But I enjoy his comedy. He also is just an interesting take on things. His book has been a lot more autobiographical than I thought it was going to be. But I've really enjoyed it. He talks about doing comedy, about pursuing it, about being both a Christian and a comedian at the same time. How is that even possible? As a guy who's a Christian and a comedian, it's interesting. And then the last book that I'll talk about this week is So Good They Can't Ignore You by Cal Newport. Cal Newport wrote another book that I read that's called Deep Work, which he's talking about the most satisfying work is work that is deep, where you get into it, where you get into a state of flow. Sometimes they'll call it that, where you'll work at a very deep level. I know I keep saying deep in work, but that's what the book's about. I do recommend it. And so far, So Good That They Can't Ignore You is very good as well. The funny part is that title comes from Steve Martin. And he mentions that in the book a couple of different times, where Steve Martin was being interviewed and they asked him, what's a good advice for young comedians? And he said, be so good they can't ignore you, which is a different mindset than a lot of comedians or comedic advice that we'll get. It's the way that Newport talks about it. It's a craftsman mindset where we're trying to be better. We're trying to perfect our craft. We're trying to learn the skills that are necessary to be really good at something. And of course, he gives a lot of different examples. I'm always applying those examples to comedy and comedy writing and things like that. But really interesting. As far as diet is going, I am currently doing a little bit of fasting, a little bit of slowing down on eating. As preparation for that, the other day I went to Chewy's, which is a Tex-Mex place. Got some enchiladas. Got some chips and salsa. Got some blizzards on the way home. Was a really good day. But now I'm going back to much more controlled eating. I said last week that a bit that I'm working on is the wheelchair commercial bit. Well, on Thursday, I threw that up, and it did a lot better than I expected. The story is I was in a commercial for a wheelchair ramp, and I think it's worth writing. So far, I've written it out one time. I've performed it one time. It's not good enough for a paid gig, but it's working. It's on its way. The new bit that I want to work on this week is a bit about my wife. So when I met her, she often offered me gum. I don't know why, but she was pretty much the only person in my life who ever offered me gum. And I have a strong philosophy. If someone offers you gum, you should probably take the gum. They're probably trying to tell you something. But she would carry gum everywhere and always offer me gum. But never offered me a whole stick of gum. She would have Orbit. So the pieces of gum are not big. These are not huge pieces of gum. And each piece is wrapped in paper, and she would rip it in half, keep half of it in the little Orbit container, and then chew the other half. Or offer it to me. So I don't know how many times she offered me gum, and it'd be like, do you want gum? I say yes. Whole or half piece? Now, when she started to give me the option, I always chose a whole piece. Because I'm a grown man. Who only choose half a piece of gum? That seemed so bizarre. However, I thought it was very endearing as well. She's this young woman. I am obviously thinking about marrying her. I did marry her, but at the time I'm thinking about marrying her, and she's always offering me half a piece of gum. That's some frugality that I can get behind. This is the kind of person who knows the value of $1. $1 means half a stick of gum or whatever. She can appreciate what goes into it. Anyway, well, that's been the podcast this week. It's been a lot of fun. Hopefully you're getting a little out of it. I'm enjoying it, and I'll see y'all next week.